So we had two lashonis. In the first lashon, the Gemara says that we have a machlokes between Reb Shimon and Reb Yehuda. The machlokes is in Shabbos, but it really applies everywhere. And that is, if you did a malacha and you didn't have kavanas to do it. And the example that the Gemara gives, if someone drags a bench across a lawn on Shabbos, he wants to get it from point A to point B, but it digs a little bit of a trench in the ground as he's dragging it because it's heavy. So Reb Yehuda holds that's usher. Davar shein mechaven is usher. You're making this trench, even though that's not your intention. And Reb Yehuda and Reb Shimon holds davar shein mechaven is mutter. There's not a problem. You're allowed to drag this across the lawn because your intention is not to plow. It's not to make a trench. Your intention is just to get the bench from point A to point B. So in the first lashon, Abaya held that Efsher v'loy mechaven. Reb Shimon says, Reb Shimon says, even though I could find some other way to get the bench across, even if it was a lighter bench, maybe I could have carried it, but I'm not having kavanah to do the malacha. It's not usher, it's mutter. And Rava holds that when does Reb Shimon allow a davar shein mechaven? That's if it's loy efsher. That's if I have no other way to get this bench across, and it's a very heavy bench, I can't lift it. But if it was a case of efsher, then of course I would have to find a way to do it where I wouldn't be doing the malacha. So in the first nusach, the machlokes is what is pshat in Reb Shimon. When Reb Shimon was mekel, was he mekel even by efsher v'loy mechaven, which is how Abaye understood him, or is Reb Shimon only mekel by loy efsher v'loy mechaven? In the second lashon, the machlokes is not in Reb Shimon. Everybody agrees that according to Reb Shimon, efsher v'loy mechaven is going to be mutter. The shayla is Reb Yehuda. Reb Yehuda, we always assume, is the machmer, because he holds if it's efsher v'loy mechaven, even if you didn't have kavanah, it's still going to be usher. That's Reb Yehuda shita. But the Gemara wants to know what would be in a case of a loy efsher where you had no other way around it, the kamachaven, but you do want to have hana, you do want the other issue to happen. So, for instance, if you're walking by the street and there's a bakery of Avodah Zarah, and you have no way to avoid it, you have to walk down that street. It's impossible to avoid it. But when you walk by that bakery, you purposely inhale and say, I'm enjoying that delicious aroma. So the question is as follows. According to Reb Shimon, for sure this would be usher. So Reb Shimon, who we always assume is the machmer when it comes to these things, here you see he might be a Reb Shimon who's always the mekel. I'm sorry. Reb Shimon is always the mekel. The whole davar shein mechaven is mutter. Over here, he might be machmer. So in the case of loy efsher, the kamachaven, since Reb Shimon says you have kavanah, it's usher, it's going to be usher. The question is according to Reb Yehuda, who's normally machmer, and he normally holds that efsher v'loy kamachaven is usher. So you see that Reb Yehuda doesn't focus on your kavanah. He focuses on whether or not it's efsher. So if that's the case, the Gemara wants to suggest that if it's loy efsher, even if it's kamachaven, maybe Rabbi Yehuda would allow you to have that anah. So Abaye learns in Rabbi Yehuda that by loy efsher for kamachaven it would be mutter, and Rava learns by loy efsher for kamachaven, even according to Rabbi Yehuda, it would be aser. That's the machlokes that we're dealing with, and that's what we're focusing on now. The Gemara is focusing on the second version of the machlokes. According to Rabbi Yehuda, who normally holds davar shein mechaven is aser, what if it was loy efsher? The kamachaven, would it be aser because it's loy efsher? And Abaye holds, since it's loy efsher, Rabbi Yehuda would agree that it's going to be mutter. So Amar Abaye, where did I get this from? That if it's loy efsher, even if you have kavanah to have anah, there still would not be an issur. The Tanya, we learned in the Brisa. Amar Alav, al Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai. It was said about Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai, he used to give drushes to the rabbis, and sometimes it was very, very sunny. So what they would do is, being that the Beis Hamikdash building was so very tall, it was 200 amas high, so therefore it would cast a long shade. So he would make sure to set up his shear in a place where everybody that was listening, enjoying the shear, would be in the shade of the Beis Hamikdash, and therefore enjoy a little bit of comfort. So the question is, In this case, it's lo efsher because Rashi says lo efsher mi lidrosh lerabim hilchas achad. Before Yom Tov, he absolutely had to make a drasha, so he had no choice. They needed to do this because they needed to learn that Torah. But and they set it up purposely to benefit from the shade of the Beis Hamikdash, the Shari, and you find that it was mutter. So you should have a rai from here, but lo yafsher umechaven would be mutter. For Rav Omar, you don't have a rai from there. Shiny heichel Yosy. The heichel is only made for its inside, and therefore, says Rashi, the ein hanas tziloi nesra. There never is iser to have a noah from the shade that the building creates. And Rashi says an interesting halacha, the ein zeh derech hanaasai, because that's not the derech to have a noah. So this actually poses a little bit of a difficulty because we learned when there's no loy soichal, it's aser even shaloy kederech hanaasai. So there's a lot of rate about it, maybe because it's Tzarech Harabim, they weren't machmer, maybe because the Meiri says that the Kedusha of the Beis HaMikdash is for the inside, not for the outside. It's the whole Isser stems from the Kedusha. There's no Isser outside. So there's different approaches to this. But at the end of the day, the Gemara says from there you don't have a right to our Shaila of Loy Efsher v'Kama Chavin, because there was a special reason why they were able to sit and enjoy the shade. I guess depending on what time of the day it was, Rabbi Yochanan had to say shir in a different place. So if he was saying shir in the afternoon, he would say that on the west side of the base. He would say it on the east side of the Beis Hamikdash because the sun would be at the west. And if he was saying shir in the morning, he probably had to say shir on the other side so that he could always take advantage. I guess he didn't say shir high noon because then wherever he would be, it would still be hot.
If it was on the
how do I know that
was
Chavin is also? Because Rav held it was also. But none we learned.
I don't think you can hear.
From time to time, they had to do repairs.
I don't think so.
In the Beis Hamikdash, and sometimes they even had to do repairs in the Beis Kodesh HaKadoshim. So how you can't just have tradesmen walking around there with their paint and their plaster. So the way they did it was Lulin Hayu Psuchin Ba'aliyas Beis Kodesh HaKadoshim. In the roof, in the ceiling, we know there was an attic. There was a second level above the Heichel and the Kodesh HaKadoshim, and they had little trapdoors in the ceiling of the Kodesh HaKadoshim. So they created these boxes that they were able to suspend from above, that they opened up the trapdoors, and they lowered down these boxes into the Beis Kodesh HaKadoshim. So imagine if you have a box that's sealed on all sides, except for one opening on the side, so that the tradesman could lean out and do a repair. So if they would lower these down on the trapdoor that was right up against the wall, so when they lowered it down, the uman wouldn't see anything in the room other than the wall that was right there in the opening to his box. And why did they do that? So the eyes of these tradesmen wouldn't benefit and enjoy the beauty of the walls of the architecture of the Beis Kodesh HaKadoshim. So let's analyze this up well. The hachacha, they have to send people in. Repairs must be done, and we're concerned that they will have a no. The kamachaven, the usher. We made sure to prevent them from seeing, because if we didn't prevent them from seeing, it would be because of lo yafsher, because they would have to be there. But the kamachaven, they would look around and take in the beauty, and that we wanted to prevent. So from the fact that we wanted to prevent that would prove that such a hana would be usher, even though it's lo yafsher, the kamachaven. In fact, the more of a tizbra, well, Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi, Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Mishum bar kapara, koil, sound, umara, and vision, or sights, the reach, and smell, I should use the word aroma, ein bahen mishum me'ila. You'll never have a chiyuv of me'ila when you have a benefit of these things. And Rashi says, koil is a klishir, shein hektish, the reich is the kataris, and ein bahen mishum me'ila, dairaisa. Why? Hoil be'ein behem mamish. There's nothing to them. You can't touch them. They're not tangible. The chivan de midairaisa sharu. Since midairaisa, it's going to be mutter. Ki lo yavshar ki ga in hacha. In a case over here where they had no option, amai atrachin rabbanim. Why were we matriach the tradesmen to go in boxes? Ela maila ba'al mahavoy. It must be an extra maila in kachim, but you cannot really bring a raya from here that lo yavshar v'kamachavin would be usher. So it says over here, me'ilu deleka ha'isura ika, it would be usher. Zok to Gemara, my love, la'oisen ha'imdim b'fnim. Let's say that where's the isser? The isser is the people who are standing inside. Zok Rashi l'shamish. The lo efsher milam micham. They have to be inside the Beis Hamikdash. V'asher liyos b'schavnim. And it's also from there. It's also for them to have kavana to be nehena from inside the Beis Hamikdash. So you see, there's an isser. Zok to Gemara. So my love, so you have a raya nachamal to Rava that loy efsher the kamachavin would be aser. Zok to Gemara. I apologize. I believe I skipped a line. We have to go back. I'm really sorry. The Tizmira. Amar b'shum ben Paz. Amar b'shum ben Levi. B'shum bakapar. Kol umara v'reich ein ba b'shum meila. Ella maila also beveis kachet kadashim. There must have been a special mile that made the base kachet kadashim. So the answer to Abayi's answer would be really efsher v'kamachavin is mutter. Why did they make boxes by the base kachet kadashim? It must have been a separate chumrah that applied only to the base kachet kadashim. But normally, in the normal case of Israel, no, lo efsher v'kamachavin would be mutter. Ika da Amri, the Ika da Amri says, Amar Rava mina, what's my makar to prove that efsher v'kamachavin would be aser? Titania, Amar b'shum ben Paz, Amar b'shum ben Levi, mishum bakapar, koil umar v'rech ein ba mishum meila, and meila hu deleka ha'isur ika. So you have nacharaya that efsher v'kamachavin would be aser. My love, the lo efsher. People are inside, have to be inside. They're doing the avodah. They're doing the necessary avodas that have to be done there, so they have to be there. So it's lo efsher. But the kamachavin, they're looking around and they're taking in the sights, the smells, and the sounds, and you see it's going to be aser. The people who are not in the Beis Hamikdash, people who are outside, there's no me'ilah, but there's an isser. But the people who are on the inside, where it's lo efsher, according to Abaye, there wouldn't even be an isser to take in the sights and sounds and the aromas of the Azara, because it's a case of lo efsher. Zok to Gemara. There's two interesting tosfos that I want to just look at that give us a little bit of an insight. So Rashi said, the Gemara says, "Me'ilahu deleka ha'yisur ika." We want to prove that there is some isser to have enough from things in the Beis Hamikdash. Tema frektos. Tanya isha bayreres chitim la'ar so beis hashayeva. If there's an isser, like the Gemara says, there's an isser. There's no me'ilah, but there's an isser to benefit from the koil, the reyach, and the mara of the Beis Hamikdash. It says that the women would use the light from the Simchas Beis Hasheva, which is part of the Beis Hamikdash, to check through their wheat kernels. V'ashemen v'apsila hoyishal kodesh. The shemen and psila that they made the light for the Simchas Beis Hasheva was shal kodesh. K'yitnan hasam. U'bi v'shalmi daik mina the koilu ma'ir v'reach ein bahen mishum me'ilah. So there's a raya from this case that there's ein bahen mishum me'ilah. Argamar says here there's an isser of bezayit shver, because we know that women would use the light. That light from the Beis Hamikdash must have illuminated a big part of the city, and the women would use that light. So based on our Gemara, that would not have been allowed. Leka isura, the whole isur for the people who are amdim b'chutz is ela shelo yikruvu atzvon la'azara kidei la'reich yosef. If I'm not trying to enjoy the smell, I'm just going about my business, I'm smelling it, there's not an isser. The isser is if I try to get a little closer so that I can get a better smell. That's when it will be also. The Hamrinon lahaisa kala tzricha le'espasim b'Yerushalayim if they rechak Torahs. The Keturah smelled so good, the whole Yerushalayim smelled so good, nobody needed perfume because the air has always smelled so nice. So you see, that Hana cannot be usher. The Isser would only be if you approach a little closer. Okay, so let's see the Gemara weiter. Gufa. Amar B'Shum ben Pazi, Amar B'Shum ben Levi, Mishum bar Kapara. Koil, Umara, V'Reach, Ein Bahen Mishum Ila. Frag the Gemara, V'Reach, Ein Bahen Mishum Ila? Are you telling me there's no Me'ila by Reach? What Tanya we learned? Hamafatim is HaKetaris L'Islamid Ba. We know there's an Isser, Isda Sheyasa. Kamoyu is a Chi of Koris. But if you're making the Ketaris, you're putting together the recipe to learn how to do it, so you're not doing it for your own benefit. Or what you plan to do with this Ketaris is donated to the base of Mikdash. Potter, then you're going to be Potter. However, if you made it to be able to use in your home to enjoy the smell, to enjoy the incense, Chayiv, that is the Chi of Koris that the Torah said you get for duplicating the Ketaris. However, the person who actually does smell it and enjoy it for his own use, Potter, he'll be Potter from Koris. The Chi of Koris is only to make the Ketaris, not to enjoy the Ketaris. Ela Shema. But if you smell the Ketaris, you're moil. So the problem is, we said earlier from Rabbi Shimon ben Levi that my reach ein b'hed mishum me'ila. Yet here you see the person who inhales the Ketaris will be chayiv for me'ila. So it's shver on Rabbi Shimon ben Levi, who said in the name of Bar Kapara that there is no me'ila for smelling. Al Amar Papa, it depends on what the situation is and when you're smelling it. So this is what you have to say. Koil Mara ein b'hen mishum me'ila, v'she'ein b'hen mamish. Koil Mara, there's nothing to it. There's no physical metzias that you're taking in. You're just seeing a vision. You're hearing a sound. But the reach, when you inhale the reach, you're actually taking in the miniature particles, and you're actually having enough from something that you could be moil from. So when do we say? When did Reb Shimon ben Pazi say? When did Bar Kapara say that reach ein ba mishum me'ila? It's reach la'acha shetala timrasai. After the smoke already went up and you already mocked the Ketaris and the mitzvah was done already, then there's no din me'ila, hoyel v'nasas mitzvahs. However, if you make Ketaris l'hariachba, so there you're smelling it as you burn it, it was surely not nasa mitzvahs, and that's why there would be an isser. That's why there would be an me'ila. So when Shubin Levi says, that's speaking after it was already burnt and the smoke went up. But before, in fact, there would be an isser of reach, because reach has a mamoshes. Let's see Rashi. You're actually, when you smell a smell, what's actually happening is there's miniature particles that are coming into your nose, and that's how you smell it. Therefore you'd be chayiv. Who took Amar Rabbi Yeshua Potter, and that Rabbi Yeshua said, you're Potter when you inhale a reach toiv of Isser. That's la'achar shetala timrasoi b'mikdash kamer. That's after the Ketaris was already hukrav and the mitzvah is over. The nasas mitzvasoi, the ein tzarech gavoya oid ba, since there is no need for the Beis Hamikdash for this Ketaris anymore, because the mitzvah was already completed. And the Braisa, who says that there is a din me'ila, it's b'mariach b'beisai shenois limel al gacholim. So that's actually enjoying the smell right after it comes off the coals, and that's when it's going to be usher. So koil and reach are never an issue. So koil and myra are never an issue. Reach it's only an issue before it was nasa mitzvasai. After it's nasa mitzvasai, it's no longer an issue. Frag the Gemara. Remember, are you saying the chol heicha, the nasas mitzvasai? Anytime the mitzvah with this item is already completed, ein boy mishum me'ila, you cannot be moil anymore. Very trumas adeshin. What is trumas adeshin? After you already makriv the karbonis, and it was nasa mitzvasai with the karbonis. The Torah tells you every day the kohen has to go take some ash from the top of the Mizbeach and put it on the floor of the base of Mikveh somewhere, or the floor of the Zohar, by the Makam Adeshin. If you're going up to Kevesh, so you're headed from south to north, it would be on your right side, which would be the east side. That's where the Makam Adeshin was. And they would put some Deshin there every day, it would be swallowed into the ground. So the problem is, by the time you're taking that ash, the carbon is already burnt to a crisp, the imurin are all burnt, which means it's nasa mitzvasai. So the Trumas Adeshin, the nasa mitzvasai, the yesh mishum me'ilah. Yet there's still a me'ilah on the ashes. How do we know that? The chsiv v'samai eitz ala mizbeach, and we darshan eitz ala mizbeach shelo yafazer. You shouldn't spread it out. It has to be placed in the very specific place. The makam adeshin. V'samu, you must put it there shelo yehena. We learn from the samu that you're not allowed to have enough from it. So the problem is, how could you say that you're not that once it's nasa mitzvasai, it's sort of discharged and there's no problem to have enough from it. You see the ashes after the carbon was burned, so the mitzvah with the meat was already discharged. There's still an Israel. And let's take it one step further. Let's make a binyan av. Since over here you see that after it's nasa mitzvasai, it's still usher. So to every place in the Torah, if it's nasa mitzvasai, it should be usher. And with the Gemara, you're right. However, we should have a trumas adeshin, who big dekahuna shnei kesuvim habam kechad. There's two psukim that are very unique. There's two inyanim that are very unique, that are different than anything else in the Torah. Where the Torah tells us there specifically that even though it's nasa mitzvasai, it's still going to be usher. The chol shnei kesuvim habam kechad ein melamdim. We have a rule that any time you have two exceptions to a rule, two unique halachas, and it only applies to two things, we say that you cannot export it to anywhere else. If you only saw it in one place, you can make a binyan av. But if the Torah specifies it in two places, that's sort of a signal not to export it. Because if you can export it to Chala Torah Kula, it would have been enough to mention it only in one place. So Trumas Adeshin Hadamara. We know Trumas Adeshin has a special pasuk v'samu to teach us that even though it's nasa mitzvasai, the ash is still asher bana. Big Day Kahuna, which you just said in the Gemara, is the second of the Shnei Kshuva Bam Ke'echad. Where do you see anything about Big Day Kahuna that it's the Shnei Kshuva Bam Ke'echad? Tichsev v'nichem sham. After the Kohen Gadol did the avodah on Yom Kippurim with his Big Day Lavan, which incidentally, the Big Day Lavan would be perfectly suitable for a Kohen Hegit to wear on a normal day. But these begodim that the Kohen Gadol wore on Yom Kippur, he must put them away. What does put them away mean? After they were used once, they could never be used again. They have to be put away. So that's an Isra, because it was nasa mitzvasai already. The Kohen Gadol already used it to do the avodah on Yom Kippur, so it should be mutter. Yet the Torah says, "V'nicham sham," they're asher ba'anah forever. You have to put them away. So you have shnei kshuva bam ke'echad. You have the pasuk of "V'nicham sham" by Big Tekehuna. You have the v'samu by Trumas Adeshin. These are two unique halachas that even though it was nasa mitzvasam, the iser hanor remains. But everywhere else in the Torah, by nasa mitzvasam wouldn't be a problem. So the Torah, once you already were marking the Torah and it's all done already, the residual smell is not a problem. Zaktamar hanichal rabbanan the Amri Melamed Chatun Geniza. It's not unanimous that the Big Day Lavan, that the Kohen Gadol wore Yom Kippur, have to be put away forever and they remain Asher Bana. But Rabdoisa, they can be repurposed. Elo Rabdoisa, the Polagalai, who argues on the Rabbanim, the Amr, they say, Al B'ru'uyin Hain, L'Kohen Hegit, they could be reused, they could be repurposed, they could be given to a Kohen Hegit. Umay V'nicham Sham. So what does the Torah mean when it says V'nicham Sham? All it means is Shlo Yishtamish Bahem B'yoyim HaKippur Macher. It just means you cannot use the same Big Day Lavan for more than one Yom Kippur. So after Yom Kippur, you can no longer use it for Yom Kippur again, but you are allowed to repurpose these begodim and give them to a Kohen Hegit. So Ma'ikal Meimer. Now you no longer have Shnei Ksuvim Bam Ke'echad. You only have Trumas Hadeshen. So why don't we learn from Trumas Hadeshen that even though it's Nasa Mitzvah, it should still remain Asur? So tomorrow, I have another trick in my hat. We should have a Trumas Hadeshen, the Egla Arufa, Shnei Ksuvim Bam Ke'echad. Trumas Adeshin and Egla Rufa are two psukim that tell you that even though it's Nasam and Tzvos, it's the Losser. And we'll get into Egla Rufa in a moment. So the halach is by Egla Rufa, they're once they're Erev to Egla Benachal in the valley, they're not allowed to have any enough from that ever again. And it says they're shum. The mashma shum take for also, and you're not allowed to have enough of it. So since Egla Rufa is unique, that even though it's nasam mitzvah, still also bana, you have the same thing by the deshen. So shnei shivam kechad ein melamdim. Zok the Gemara. Hanicha lemandama ein melamdim. That works well if you hold shnei shivam bam kechad ein melamdim. You can't learn anywhere else. This halacha. Elamandam melamdim is actually a mandam who holds even shnei shivam bam kechad. You could make a binyan av and you could export that to everywhere else in Torah. So why don't you learn from Egla Rufa and from Deshen and from maybe from the Big Huna, that it's relevant? Why don't you learn the Chalatar Kula that even though it's not so much it's still also Michael Maimer? So tomorrow Trey Miyutik CV. There's two miyutim besides the fact that it's Shnei Shuvah Bam Kachad. There's also psukim in each of these halachas that state specifically teach us that this halacha shouldn't apply anywhere. It says v'samu. It says by the Trumas Hadeshin v'samu etzel mazech v'samai. What is the restriction that even though it's nasam mitzvah, it's the loser samai? This halacha, the ashen of Beis Hamikdash, but everything else wouldn't have this restriction. Chziv ha'arufa. And by Egla Rufa, it is Egla ha'arufa with the Heya Yediyah, again to tell us that this halacha, that the Kedusha remains, the Isra remains, even though it was Nasa Mitzvah, only applies to this case of Arufa, not to other things. Tashma Fektimar. Ichnisa l'Rivka. A Rivka is when you tie animals together, you tie a group of animals together, sometimes to pull a plow, you tie them together, or sometimes just to keep them together, they shouldn't scatter, you tie them together. So Ichnisa l'Rivka, you connected a para aduma. Now there's actually two types of animals that could never have had done any work. There's the para aduma, and there's the egla rufa. Rashi learns Echlisa l'Rivka. Our case here is talking about egla rufa. Tosfos learns it's talking about para aduma, but it doesn't really matter because both para aduma and egla rufa are disqualified from use if they were worked with. So Echlisa l'Rivka, any one of these two animals, you took it into a group of animals and you tied them together. Rashi says Rivka is kupla balaj shekoishrin arba paris biyachad. It's an arrangement where they tie four animals together, and then vidasha, and there was some wheat chaff over there on the floor, and the animals together walked on top of this wheat, and what they did is they separated the kernels from the waste, and that's called threshing. That's a malacha. So the malacha is kshera. Why is it kosher? Look, Rashi, shaloi niskavelakach. When you tied these animals together, you tied them together because you didn't want to scatter, but you never had an intention that you wanted the animal to thresh. Never v'lav. It's not called up an avoda. The animal is still par aduma or negla rufa. Imagine a par aduma that you messed up by mistake by doing avoda with it. There's a loss of hundreds of thousands of dollars. Zok the Gemara, how about b'shvil shetina v'tidosh? What if the reason why you tied them together is A, you wanted to be able to nurse from its mother, so I guess its mother was one of the animals that you tied it to, but you also figured while they're tied together, let them accomplish disha as well. Then it's puzzle. Frek the Gemara, v'hachad lo yefsher. Here it was lo yefsher. You had to tie this animal together with its mother because you need to let it nurse from its mother. Yet you also had kavana for a different hanoah, the hanoah of disha, the katani psula. So this is a raya to Rava against Abaye because it's a case of lo yafsher, and I am a chaven, but I had to do it anyway, and it still disqualifies. It still puzzles either the egla rufa or the paraduma. Zok to Gemara, you don't have a raya from there. The shiny hasam Normally, Zoktabaye, Avada, if it's loy efsher, it's not going to be a problem. But by Egla Roof and by Paraduma, the Torah uses the word Asher loy Ubadba. That no Ubadba means not Ovadba means you didn't work with it. It means you took it and schlepped it to work. Ubadba means even if it happens without your interference, it's also going to be a problem. So since there's Asher loy Ubadba, even the slightest malacha will be a problem. We call Makayim. Therefore, it's also the para becomes disqualified from being a paraduma because it was lo efsher v'kamachavin. Even that little lo efsher v'kamachavin, even though normally it wouldn't be a problem, by paraduma, since it says shali ubadba, it will be a problem. Frank the Gemara, if you're telling me if a malacha happens by itself, it should also disqualify the paraduma because of a special pasuk. Asher lo ubadba, yihacha afilu reishanami. Even if I was Ichnisa L'Rivka, and I had no intention to do anything with it, Vidasha, and on its own, it plowed, it should also be usher, because of the Pasuk Asher L'Ubadba. If Malacha happens with it, whether it's your intent or not, it should still disqualify the para from being used for a para duma or from an Egla Rufa. So Yachai Fila Reishanami. Zaktamara, Haloi Damya, you cannot compare the case of where I had no intention whatsoever for this animal to do amalacha, to do disha, and it did it by itself. That you cannot compare to our case where you took the animal and you tied it with others and you had specific intent for it to be manic and for it to do disha. That's much worse. So haladamya elalaha. This will be daimya. The first case of the brash will be daimya to the following case. Shachin Allah. What if this paradum is standing and a bird landed on it? So now it's pulling weight. It's carrying something. There it's kshera. But Allah zachar. But if a male animal came on this paraduma and mated with the animal, even though you didn't do it, the animal came by itself. Sula, it would be possible. Why? My timer. Amar Papa, iksiv avad. If the pasuk would have said the word avad, which is exactly the spelling of the word in the Torah, but the Karinan avad and the Nakudais, the way we read it would say avad. So then I would say ad avad ba'ihu. The only time you disqualify a paraduma or an egla rufa is if you yourself induced the animal to work. You made it work. Only there would it disqualify. Iksav ubad, the Karinan ubad, if it said ubad spelled with the vav, and you read it that way, which is the way we actually read it, then I would say afilu v'melanami, even if a bird landed on it, the animal supported weight, it's disqualified. But neither of those two cases are true. Hashtag the chsiv avad, the word is written avad without a vav, but the Karinan ubad, we read it with a vav, therefore we dash in that has to be ubad dumyud avad. Sure, if the animal ends up doing a malacha that you didn't induce, if it happened by itself, it would still be asher. That's only if it's similar to avad, it's similar to a case where you actually made the animal do work. What does that mean? By avad, when you make it to work, clearly you want it to do that work. So too, even if the animal did work by itself, if you're happy with the work that it did, that will disqualify this paraduma from being a good paraduma. So therefore, when I was a Chnisa L'Rivka, and I had no intention for it to do anything, I didn't want it to dash. Since I didn't want it to dash, this animal remains a good animal. It's kosher for a paraduma. But in the second case, where I brought it lahanik, and I also wanted it to do disha, even though I didn't make it do disha, but clearly my mind wants that to happen, even though it happened by itself, it's going to disqualify the paraduma. So Tosfos asks, Apasha Takashi. Tosfos asks, let me ask you a question. If I have a paraduma, and it does work, that's going to cause me a great loss of money. So there's no way you can argue that when I brought this animal and I tied it with the other animals for it to nourish, that I really wanted it to do disha. Because for a little bit of benefit of doing disha, I'm not going to sacrifice and endanger the value, the hundreds of thousands of dollars that this para would be worth. So how could you say, Zok Tosfos, that it's called nichale? And for Tosfos is very pashut. If it would have been kosher, if the fact that the animal did this malacha without me making it do malacha, if that wouldn't have disqualified the animal, avada I would want it. So you don't take into account the fact that once it does a malacha, the animal loses its value because it loses its status of a paraduma. Because when I'm having to do malacha, I'm having to do the malacha in a way where I think it will not disqualify. And therefore, you don't take into account that he wouldn't have wanted to do a malacha that would disqualify. He assumed it wouldn't disqualify. Tashma, Aveda. What if you found an article of clothing and on the ground? Now you have to pick it up, and you have a responsibility to watch this Aveda until you could find its rightful owner and you could return it. So the question is, are you allowed to benefit from this Aveda? If it's a sheet, you shouldn't spread it on your bed and use it. And don't hang it on a peg that you have on the wall. If it benefits you to do that. But if to protect the article of clothing, to protect the sheet, it's better if it's spread out on the bed instead of just crumpled up in a drawer and it gets air, or you hang it up, it makes it better. Of course, you're allowed to do that because that's the best thing for the object that you found. Now, what happens if this you have visitors? Now, when you have visitors, it's nice to show that you have beautiful linens. So then, even if it's going to benefit the beged to be spread out that way, but since it's going to benefit you because it makes you look good to your guests, that wouldn't be allowed. So that's a case of efsher, lo efsher, the kamachaven. It's lo efsher because I have to do for this cloth, for this beged, what's best for it. So I didn't have to spread it on the bed. But for kamachaven, I'm also having kavanah to have enough from it because it makes me look good that I have beautiful linens. And you see, it's also. So you have a raya against the baye to Rafa. So tomorrow it's not a raya. Shiny husband the kalila. It's not good for the beged to spread it out when there's a guest there. It destroys the beged. When you're showing off a beged, it actually destroys the beged. Either because when they look at it, there might be an ein hara on it, and that will ruin it, or imishum gamvin. It's very possible that the reason why these people came to visit you is they're just checking out your premises because they plan to come back when you're not around and steal. So therefore, there's no benefit even to the beged of displaying it when you have foreigners in your house. Toshma, moichriksos. What happens if you are a seller of clothing and some of the clothing that you sell happen to have sharpness, which means you wouldn't be allowed to wear it. But if you're just selling it and you're wearing it because you are the mannequin, then moichin kedarkon, you're allowed to use your own body to display your beautiful clothing. As long as when you're wearing those clothing, you're intended not to warm yourself with it, which is when the Isser Klayim is triggered. But your intent is you're just wearing it because you're the coat rack with which you can display your wares. And under those circumstances, there's no Isser to wear Klayim. However, Vatsnuin, the Gar Erlicha merchants that sell clothing, they are concerned. They don't wear these clothing, even if they want to display them. They take a stick, they put it on the stick, and they put the stick over their shoulder, so they're not benefiting at all from the clothing, and the clothing is still hanging on a hook, of which they are the hook, and that's the way they display their wares. Everybody could do what the tznuin does. Everybody could put it on a stick on their backs. Nevertheless, when they're wearing it themselves, so it's efsher, but for loika machavin, they're not having kavana to do this, sir. It's going to be mutter. So you see, klor by efsher, the loika machavin, it's going to be mutter. So let's think, who is that a problem for? Who holds efsher the loika machavin would be also? So in the first lashon, according to the way we went to Rava said that even Reb Shimon, who said that a dover she'ein mechaven is mutter, that's only if it's efshir. But it's efshir, zokt Rava, even Reb Shimon would agree that it would be usher. So that's the problem over here. In this case, all these merchants, they don't have to wear the clothing. They could find another method, hang it on a stick that they have over their shoulders. So it's efshir. The loika mechaven, they're not having kavanah to enjoy the benefit of the warmth of the beged, and the Brisa says that it's mutter. Zokt Gemara tiyufta leman demasni lishna kama de Rava tiyufta. It's going to be an upslug to the Manda Amar who, in the first nusach of what the machlokes Abai and Rava was, this will be against Rava in the first shot of the Gemara. Now we're going all the way back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah said, when you have chametz that's after the mambir, it's asher ba'ano, you're not allowed to use it as fuel in your oven. Taner Rabban, Taner shesiku beklipe arla or bekashin shaklaya kerem. What happens if you use this fuel in your oven, isure heno, and that's what you heated your oven with? Now, the way ovens work is the very first time an oven is heated up, its walls become forged and hard, and that's when the oven is complete. Once that occurs, the only purpose of ever adding heat to an oven is to be able to cook with it. So the halacha is, if you use the Isurei Hano to heat up an oven, chadash, if it's a brand new oven, meaning this Isur Hano flame was used to actually create the oven, it was the final process in making the oven, yutatz. You have to destroy the oven, because the oven now is Isur Hano. Rashi says, Sharei al yedei hesek zeshel orla, through this heat of orla, which was Isur Hano, nigmar, the oven became complete, umiskayim kuloi, so the whole existence of this oven is through the Isur Hano. Yoshan, it was an older oven. Yutzam, all you have to do is let it cool off before you bake in it, and you're not allowed to benefit from the heat of the fire that you had there to bake something. What happens if afa boyes apas? You bake bread, so you actually violated the Isra Hano. You had Hano from the heat of the Klaya Kerem or of the Orla, and you bake the bread with it. So what's Allah? Rabbi Omer hapas asura. This bread is going to be asur. The Chachamim hapas muteres. The Chacham say this bread would be muter v'hano. What's the machlokes? Rashi says Rabbi Omer hapas asura the yesh shvach atze itcher bepas. You have to understand. Everybody agrees I was over an Isser. I had a no from the fire to bake the bread. But does that mean the bread has Isser ano in it? Zokt Rebbe, yes. We say that part of the hana that you're having from the past when you use it, you're also indirectly having hana from the eitzim, and therefore we say part of the eitzim that are asher b'hana is in this bread, and therefore you're not even allowed to eat the bread that was baked with this fire. But the Chamam Mapas Muteris, sorry they hold, ain't shach eitzim b'pas mamish. Sure, you had a no, you did something wrong when you baked it, but there is no Isser Hanoah content in this bread. Therefore, very important lines of Rashi, Uhuadin the les lunami chodesh yutatz. In the earlier case where we said you forged a brand new oven with it, you have to break the oven. According to the Chachamim, you weren't allowed to do it, but once you did it, there is no Isser Hanoah in the walls of this oven, just like there's no Isser Hanoah in this bread, and therefore you would not have to break the oven, and you would be able to use the bread. So Rabbi Yomer Pasa, so Rabbi Chachamim Pas Muteres. What about Bishla al Gabi Gechalim? So in this case, you didn't directly heat the oven or the bread with not oven. You didn't directly heat the bread that you were baking on the fire, on the active fire. You waited till the fire died down, and now the wood is just glowing. It's a glowing ember. So the fire is not directly heating up your bread. Then give Re'akoil mutter. Everybody would agree that bread is mutter. Frank the Gemara, about Tanya we learned, Bein Chadash, Uvein Yashan Yutzan. We had another brisa that says that even in a new oven, you don't have to break. Gemara, Lo Kasha, Harabi, Harabana. This brisa that says Chadash Yutzan would be very good according to the Rabbanan, who there's no Shvach Eitzim in the past. There's no Shvach Eitzim in the oven. Therefore, you're allowed to use it. But Rebbe holds the essence of the Isra Hana goes into what it improves to the walls of the oven or the bread, and therefore you wouldn't be able to use it. Zoktamar, Amor de Shamas to the Rebbe, maybe, why does Rebbe say Isser? Mishum de Yesh Shvach Eitzim Bepas. So since the Shvach Eitzim Bepas, that's why it's going to be Isser. But Zev Zeh Goyim, Mi Shamas Lei, who said that he would hold that even the oven would be Isser? Because let's think about it. If the oven's Isser to use, why is the oven Isser to use? Because anything else that you bake in this oven would have got the benefit from the oven. But guess what? When you bake something else in this oven, you're going to have to put new wood in there to heat the oven up. That new wood will be new wood of heter. So the next bread that's being baked in this oven is going to have two components to it. It's going to have the oven component, which in fact is Isser, according to Rebbe. And it's also going to have the kosher mutudika wood that you use for fuel. Who said there Rebbe would hold that it's Isser? I understand if I bake bread directly in the fire of Isser Hana, so the whole bread is created with Isser Hana. But if I'm using wood that's not Isser Hana in an oven that might contain Isser Hana, the bread that I'm baking has two ingredients, has two components to it. And who said when there's two components involved, we also say that it's Isser? Elaloi Kasha, you're right. In order to mandate that you have to break the oven that was forged with the heat in Isser Hana, you have to hold that Zev Vizeh Goyim is also. So therefore, we'll say Harab Eliezer, Harabanim. The brisa that says that you have to break the oven is going according to Rabbi Eliezer, who we're going to prove holds Zeh Vizeh Goyim. So we'll stop here, and tomorrow we're going to learn the sugya of Zeh Vizeh Goyim, when you have two ingredients to something. One ingredient is heter, and one is Isser. Does that make the product Isser as well? That will be the subject of tomorrow's discussion. Okay, everybody, have a wonderful, wonderful day.